Appendix 4, Revolution of Dignity. The Euromaidan protests, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, represented a watershed moment in Ukraine's post-Soviet history. What began as peaceful demonstrations against the government's rejection of the EU Association Agreement transformed into a mass movement against corruption, abuse of power, and Russian influence. The revolution succeeded in ousting Yanukovych, but came at a high cost, leading to Russia's annexation of Crimea and war in eastern Ukraine, a conflict that would later escalate into Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Yanukovych's presidency and power consolidation. Viktor Yanukovych's victory in the 2010 presidential election marked a significant reversal of Ukraine's Orange Revolution. Winning with 48.95% of the vote against Yulia Tymoshenko's 45.47%, his election reflected widespread public disappointment with the Orange government's internal conflicts and unfulfilled promises rather than an enthusiastic embrace of his platform. International observers generally assessed the election as meeting democratic standards, ironically, a testament to the institutional reforms implemented after the 2004 electoral fraud that had previously denied him the presidency. Upon taking office, Yanukovych quickly moved to centralize power and dismantle the Orange legacy. His first significant step came in March 2010 when his Party of Regions formed a parliamentary coalition through controversial means, including individual deputies switching factions in possible violation of constitutional provisions. More dramatically, in October 2010, the Constitutional Court reversed the 2004 constitutional reforms that had limited presidential authority, thereby restoring the strong presidential system that had existed under Kuchma. This legal maneuver, widely believed to have resulted from pressure on judges, significantly expanded Yanukovych's powers over the government and parliament. The Yanukovych administration systematically targeted opposition leaders with selective prosecutions, most notably former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko. In August 2011, Tymoshenko was arrested on charges of abuse of office related to a 2009 gas deal with Russia, and by October, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Similar cases were opened against other opposition figures. The European Union and United States condemned these prosecutions as politically motivated, with the European Court of Human Rights later ruling that Tymoshenko's detention was arbitrary and politically motivated. These cases became a major obstacle in Ukraine's European integration process. Yanukovych's governance style increasingly resembled a family business model, with his son Alexander and a small circle of associates from his home Donetsk region, known as the family, accumulating unprecedented wealth and influence. This group quickly controlled key economic sectors through opaque privatizations and regulatory advantages. According to Anders Aslund's estimates, the Yanukovych family may have extracted $8 to $10 billion annually from the Ukrainian economy through various corrupt schemes, a staggering figure for a country with a GDP of approximately $180 billion at the time. The European Association Agreement and Russian pressure. Despite his pro-Russian reputation, Yanukovych initially maintained Ukraine's European integration course, apparently believing he could balance between Russia and the EU while extracting benefits from both. Negotiations on an association agreement with the European Union, which included a deep and comprehensive free trade area, DCFTA, had begun under the previous administration and continued under Yanukovych. By March 2012, the agreement text was initialed, though not yet signed. The EU established clear conditions for signature, centering on electoral reform, ending selective justice, particularly Tymoshenko's case, and broader judicial reforms. As Ukraine moved closer to signing the association agreement, Russia intensified pressure to derail the process. The Kremlin viewed the agreement as a geopolitical threat that would irreversibly pull Ukraine into the Western orbit and undermine plans for a Russia-led Eurasian integration project. In August 2013, Russia implemented punitive trade restrictions on Ukrainian imports, creating immediate economic pain. Kremlin advisor Sergei Glaziev explicitly warned that signing the EU agreement would be a suicidal economic decision for Ukraine, threatening that Russia would implement a full trade embargo that could cost Ukraine billions in exports. Simultaneously, Russia offered inducements for Ukraine to join its customs union instead, including substantial financial aid and reduced gas prices. For Ukraine, heavily dependent on Russian energy and markets, these were consequential considerations. Furthermore, Russian President Vladimir Putin consistently emphasized the historical, cultural, and religious ties between the countries, promoting a narrative that Russians and Ukrainians were one people artificially divided by political borders. These Russian tactics created genuine economic dilemmas for Ukraine. Implementation of EU standards would require significant short-term costs and restructuring for many Ukrainian industries, particularly in the industrial east, while access to the Russian market could be severely restricted. Ukrainian oligarchs were divided based on their sectoral interests. Those oriented toward European markets generally supported the agreement, while those dependent on Russian trade often opposed it. Nevertheless, public opinion polls consistently showed majority support for European integration, particularly among younger Ukrainians and those in the country's western and central regions. The Vilnius summit and Yanukovych's reversal. Throughout 2013, preparations accelerated for signing the association agreement at the Eastern Partnership Summit scheduled for November 28 to 29 in Vilnius, Lithuania. The Ukrainian parliament passed several EU-required reform laws, and EU envoys made numerous visits to Kiev to monitor progress. By November 18, EU foreign ministers determined that while Ukraine had not fully met all conditions, particularly regarding Tymoshenko's case, sufficient progress had been made to proceed with signing. Therefore, the sudden reversal on November 21, 2013, just 1 week before the summit, shocked both domestic and international observers. The Ukrainian government issued a decree suspending preparations for signing the association agreement, citing national security concerns and the need to restore trade volumes with Russia. This decision followed Yanukovych's secret meeting with Putin in Moscow on November 9 and intense Russian economic pressure, including threatened gas supply disruptions and trade sanctions. The government's last-minute reversal struck many Ukrainians as a betrayal of national aspirations and a capitulation to Russian pressure. That same evening, Afghan-born Ukrainian journalist and activist Mustafa Nayyem posted a Facebook call for protest on Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, meet at 22:30 under the Monument of Independence. Dress warmly, bring umbrellas, tea, coffee, good mood and friends. This social media post initiated what would become the largest protest movement in independent Ukraine's history. Initially modest in size, the protests grew significantly after Yanukovych attended the Vilnius summit but refused to sign the association agreement despite European leaders' last-minute efforts to change his mind. By December 1, demonstrations reached an estimated 400,000 to 800,000 participants, transforming from a targeted protest against the EU decision into a broader anti-government movement. Opposition political leaders, including Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Vitaly Klitschko, and Oleg Yanukovych, quickly aligned themselves with the protests, though civil society activists maintained significant autonomy and influence within the movement. From peaceful protest to revolution. The Euromaidan protests might have gradually dissipated without the government's fateful decision to use force. In the early hours of November 30, 2013, Berkut Special Police brutally dispersed several hundred peaceful student protesters who had remained overnight on the square, ostensibly to clear space for New Year decorations. Video footage of officers beating unarmed students circulated widely on social media, triggering massive public outrage and bringing hundreds of thousands of citizens to the streets on December 1. This violent crackdown transformed a European integration protest into a broader movement against police brutality, corruption, and authoritarian governance. Protesters occupied Kiev City Hall and the trade unions building, establishing a permanent presence and building elaborate barricades around the Maidan. The occupation took on increasingly sophisticated organizational structures, including self-defense units, medical services, food distribution systems, and regular stage presentations that maintained morale. The movement adopted the name Revolution of Dignity, Revolucja Hidności, reflecting its evolution beyond EU integration to encompass fundamental questions of human rights, democracy, and national sovereignty. Attempts at negotiation proved futile. On December 17, following Yanukovych's meeting with Putin, Russia announced a $15 billion loan package and reduced gas prices for Ukraine. Opposition leaders denounced this as selling Ukraine's independence for short-term financial gain. The government's position hardened significantly on January 16, 2014, when Parliament hastily passed a package of repressive legislation, dubbed dictatorship laws, that criminalized virtually all forms of protest and severely restricted civil society and media freedoms. Modeled after similar Russian legislation, these laws were passed with a simple show of hands without proper parliamentary procedure. This legislative assault on civil liberties triggered a new phase of more confrontational protests, leading to violent clashes on Hrushevskoho Street near government buildings. The first protest deaths occurred on January 22, when activists Serhiy Negoyan and Mikhail Jizhnevsky were killed by security forces. As pressure mounted, Prime Minister Mykola Azarov resigned on January 28, and Parliament repealed most of the anti-protest laws, but these concessions came too late to defuse the crisis. The February violence and Yanukovych's fall. The deadliest days of the revolution came on February 18 to 20, 2014, when security forces attempted to clear the Maidan using armored vehicles, water cannons, and live ammunition. In response, protesters armed themselves with improvised weapons and Molotov cocktails. The violence escalated dramatically on February 20, when unidentified snipers fired on protesters from rooftops, killing dozens in what became known as the Massacre on the Maidan. These shootings, which killed approximately 100 protesters, later memorialized as the Heavenly Hundred, and several police officers, remain partially unresolved, though evidence suggests the primary responsibility lies with Yanukovych-era security forces. The scale of violence shocked the international community and accelerated diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. On February 21, European foreign ministers brokered an agreement between Yanukovych and opposition leaders that called for early presidential elections, constitutional reform, and amnesty for protesters. However, many Maidan activists rejected this compromise, demanding Yanukovych's immediate resignation. That night, Yanukovych fled Kiev, first to eastern Ukraine and later to Russia, effectively abandoning his office. On February 22, 2014, the Ukrainian parliament voted overwhelmingly, 328 votes in favor, to remove Yanukovych from office, citing his dereliction of duty and role in violence against citizens. Parliament appointed Speaker Oleksandr Turchinov as interim president and scheduled presidential elections for May 25. Yulia Tymoshenko was released from prison the same day and appeared on the Maidan stage, though her reception was notably lukewarm, indicating the movement's independence from established political figures. Russian response and the beginning of armed conflict. Russia refused to recognize the new Ukrainian government, describing the events as an unconstitutional coup orchestrated by Western powers. With remarkable speed and precision, Russia moved to exploit Ukraine's moment of vulnerability. On February 27 to 28, 2014, just days after the Sochi Winter Olympics concluded, armed men in unmarked uniforms, later acknowledged by Putin as Russian soldiers, but dubbed Little Green Men, at the time, seized key infrastructure and government buildings in Crimea. The Russian parliament quickly authorized the use of military force in Ukraine, and by early March, Moscow had established complete military control over the Crimean peninsula. On March 16, 2014, under Russian military occupation, Crimean authorities organized a hastily arranged referendum on joining Russia, reporting an implausible 96.7% vote in favor with 83.1% turnout. 2 days later, Putin signed a treaty incorporating Crimea into the Russian Federation, completing the first forcible annexation of territory in Europe since World War II. The international community overwhelmingly rejected this annexation as illegal, with the UN General Assembly adopting Resolution 68/262 affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia's actions extended beyond Crimea, as armed separatist movements emerged in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions in April 2014. These movements, receiving substantial Russian military, financial, and political support, declared People's Republics and held their own controversial referendums on independence in May. By summer, the conflict had escalated into a full-scale war, with Russian weapons, volunteers, and eventually regular troops crossing the border to support separatist forces. The Ukrainian military, initially unprepared and under-equipped, gradually mobilized to defend national sovereignty. This armed conflict, which continued at varying intensity levels for years, marked a fundamental rupture in Ukraine-Russia relations and a dramatic shift in European security. The Euromaidan's success in ousting Yanukovych came at the tremendous cost of lost territory, thousands of lives, over 1 million displaced persons, and billions in economic damage. Yet it also catalyzed unprecedented Ukrainian national unity and accelerated the country's Western orientation. Ukraine signed the political provisions of the Association Agreement on March 21, 2014, with the economic components following in June, and the agreement fully entered into force in September 2017. The events of 2013 to 2014 thus set Ukraine on a trajectory of European integration and resistance to Russian domination that would culminate in Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022.